Hello, in this video, I want to go over how to create a GitHub release using GitHub Actions. GitHub releases are a way to package and distribute software in a user-friendly way. They're built on top of Git tags, which are specific points in a GitHub repository's history. But they also add extra context, and you can include downloadable assets in the release. Creating one manually is actually fairly easy. If you head over to any repository, you'll find this release section here, and you could actually click on there and click on the draft release here. So I'm gonna create one right now that's gonna be a version 0.0.5, just to give you an example. I click draft release, and I want to create the next version, so 0.0.5, and I'm gonna tell it to create a new tag to point to the main branch, and I'm just gonna call this release v0.0.5 and example release. That's what I'm gonna put in the description. And you could attach binaries if you want to, but we're not gonna do that. I'm gonna set this as the latest release, and I'm gonna publish the release. And that's it. It's very simple to create a release manually. That's fine once or twice, but doing this over and over again could get quite annoying. And that's why it's very beneficial to automate this using GitHub Actions. And so today we're gonna go over how to create a GitHub Actions workflow that automatically releases GitHub releases for us. So let's jump to it. Okay, so in the repo, you will put the workflow under the directories .github/workflows. I'm gonna call the workflow releases. Okay, and so once we have our workflow file, we just jump right in and create the GitHub Actions release workflow. So first thing is the name, and we'll call it release. The next part is the triggers. We're gonna have two triggers, one on a push to the main branch and another one on a pull request against the main branch. The next part is the jobs. We're going to have one job, and it's gonna be the release job, and it's gonna have a total of 4 steps. So release job, we wanna specify the runner, runs on, and we'll just use Ubuntu latest. And now the steps. So 4 steps in total. The first one is the checkout step. The checkout step is probably the most commonly used step, and it just allows us to check out the repository code into the workflow. Without it, there's no access to the repository. That one's very simple, and it's just that. The second step is gonna be the step that's gonna allow us to decide what sort of release we are going to be creating. In semantic versioning, there is the concept of a major release, a minor release, and a patch release. So this particular action is going to allow us to utilize PR labels to determine the type of release that's going to be created. The label will essentially specify whether it's a major release, a minor release, or a patch release. So to do this, we're gonna use the get labels action. And what this action does is it allows us to read labels from a repository. And we'll take a look at the README in 1 second. We're gonna pass 4 parameters: the GitHub token, the label key, the label value order, and the default label value. So let's head over to the action repository and take a look at the different inputs to understand what they do. Okay, so when you're in the get labels action repository, which is the action we're using, we can come down to the README, and the inputs allows us to see what each of the inputs we're using does. So the first input we're using is the GitHub token. And here we can see GitHub token, and it is the token used that gives us permission to actually read the labels. So we need that so we can actually read the labels and be able to determine the different release from the label. The second input we're using is the label key. The label key is used to specify the key within a label that we will be looking for. So we are going to be placing labels in our pull requests that look in this format. And essentially the key is gonna be the bump. So we're gonna specify bump here so that anytime there's a label with a bump colon, we can then grab the value. So if we come here, we specify bump, so that will allow us to look for labels with a key bump. Next is label value order. So label value order essentially defines the order of most importance for each type of release we want. So what that means is if there are multiple labels, what order do we take first? And we're essentially saying that if there's multiple labels and there's a patch and a minor label available, we'll take the patch. If there's a minor and a major, we'll take the minor. and if there's all three, we'll take the pash. So it's just a way to specify the most important label if there's a conflict with the labels in the repository. And the final input is the default label value, and that's pash. And default label value is just the value that will be returned if there are no labels in the repository. And that's it. So this action just allows us to determine what release we're going to be making. The next action is going to be the action responsible for creating the tag that the release is going to use. And for this, we're going to use the GitHub tag action. And what this action will do is it will create a tag for us to use within our release. So we're gonna use this action with 4 inputs, the GitHub token, which like before is gonna be for giving permissions to the actions so that it can create tags. And we're gonna take a look at the README to understand what these other 3 inputs do. Okay, so if you're in the GitHub tag action repository, we can go down to the README and we can take a look at the inputs. So GitHub token just gives us the permissions so that we can look at the tags and create the tags. Next, we have the default bump. And according to the README, this is just the bump to use when none is explicitly provided. Now, this action has several ways which you can provide what kind of release you want. In our case, we're actually gonna treat this as the input of the previous action. So this is where we're gonna provide the input we get from the labels that's gonna tell this action whether it's going to be a pash release, a minor release, or a major release. So as you can see, we go steps, bump label, outputs, label value. And this outputs is using the bump label ID, which basically gives us the label value output. So therefore, by providing the output here, we're telling this action what kind of release we want to do. The next part is the dry run. The dry run basically lets us calculate the next version without actually creating the tag. So what we do here is we say, if this is a pull request event, do a dry run. Because if it's a pull request event, we don't actually want the release to take place, and therefore we just want to calculate the tag that would possibly be created if this was a push event. And the final one here is the tag prefix. And the tag prefix is just the prefix that's added to the tag. And in our case, we're just gonna use the V. Okay, and the last step here is actually creating the release. And for that, we're gonna use the release action. And all this is gonna do is create the release and attach the tag we created in the previous step to it. So we are gonna use this action with 3 inputs, the tag input, the name input, and the body input. We could probably guess from the names of these inputs what they do, but let's take a the README just to be sure. Okay, so when we're in the repo for the release action, we can take a look at the different inputs. So first off, we have the tag input. And so the tag input is an optional tag to the release. So basically, this is the input of what tag we're gonna use. It's not required, but we're gonna specify it so we can tell the release what tag we wanted to use since we calculated the tag in the previous step. The second one is the name, and the name is simply the name of the release. And so what we do for that is we say release and the tag. So if it's release version 1, it will be release version 1. That's the name of the release. And the third input is the body. And this is essentially the description of the release. And for this, we're gonna use the changelog outputs. And these are outputs provided by the previous release step we did. So the tag version step provides for us the new tag. This is in charge of calculating the new tag and pushing the new tag. So therefore, it allows us to grab that new tag. And it also provides for us a changelog output, which is essentially a list of the changes that happened between this new release and the previous release, which is perfect because that's what we want to describe in the body of the release. We want to describe what changes happened between the previous release and the new release. And so that pretty much does it. Let's just quickly cover what we did really quickly, and then we're gonna test this out. So first thing we did was we checked out the code of the repo because we need access to the repo to be able to even calculate the tags. The second one is we used an action that allows us to read labels that will provide a way for us to decide what kind of release we're gonna have. So whether it's a pash release, a minor release, or a major release. The third step is where we actually create the tag that's going to be used for the release. So this action is in charge of A, calculating what the previous tag was, and then depending on the type of release that's going to happen, whether it's a patch release, a minor release, or a major release, creating the new release tag and pushing it out. And the third step creates the release. And this is the part that actually creates the release, and it uses the outputs from the previous step to tell it what tag to use in the release, as well as the body, which is the changelog, which specifies the changes between the previous release and the new release based on the tags. And the one last part to this workflow that we need is we need to provide permissions so that the workflow can actually write to the repo, because we have tags that need to be pushed. So let's do that right now. And so we can do that with permissions, and we want contents, right? And that will allow the workflow to be able to push the tag to the repo so that it can be used in the release. Okay, and that's it. So let's get this merged in and test it out. Okay, so I'm sitting here in the same repo where we created the workflow, which is here, and it's in the main branch, and we are going to create a new release here. This is just a fun little Python library that just has some random functions. So I'm gonna head over to one of the functions. I'm gonna update one of the functions, the rainbow function, which just prints out the text we pass to it in colors, and I'm just gonna add a prefix to it. I'm gonna call that prefix testing releases, and that's it. And I'm gonna create a PR out of this, and we're gonna see how the releases work. So we have the pull request with the update, and we wanna create a new release. So to create the new release, we just need a merge, but let's say we want this release to be a major update. And so since we have the action which reads labels, we can create a label that's bump, and we can call it bump major. Okay, and so if we have this bump major label, the release that should happen is a major release. So since right now the repo is still sitting on versions v0.0.5, the next release that should happen is the version 1 release, because we're doing a major release. It should be v1.0.0. Okay, so let's merge, and that should trigger the action, and it's running. And this should create a major release for us. Once it's done, we will double check. So if we go to code and we go to releases, we have version 1. Okay, so to wrap it up, let's just test that we can utilize this Python library. Okay, so I have a main.py where I'm calling the Python library. Is using the fun utilities with the roll dice, rainbow, tiny hatch, and emoji, which are the functions available in that library. And we can see that the function we updated was the rainbow function. And so let's run this with the latest release and see if that prefix we added gets outputted. So to do that, I need to change the reference in the requirements. And I just want to say v1.0.0. That way we are using our latest release. Okay, so I can run the pip3 install requirements so that I get my latest release, and we can see it's pulling version 1.0.0. And once it does that, we can test it by running the functions. And we can see that it did add the testing release we added to the function. It's all in there. And that's it. That is how you create a GitHub Actions workflow to automate your GitHub releases. It's very easy to do, and even though it's extremely simple to manually create GitHub releases, it is much simpler to have automation in place that does it for you. Anyways, that's the video. If you enjoyed this video, you can find some of my other content over here, and I will catch you in the next one. Bye-bye.